My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I'm going to talk about a set of parallels that I mentioned in my previous video on whether Beren would have gotten his hand back after being reincarnated, or, as some people pointed out, maybe just resurrected. And I mentioned in that video that I noticed some parallels between Beren and Maedhros, because both of them are after a Silmaril and they both lose a hand. I started looking into it more deeply. There are so many parallels. It kind of blew my mind, and I don't even think I've found them all, but I'm doing this video now anyway because I don't... If I found many more parallels, I wouldn't even be able to cover them all in one video. But it's interesting because recently Girl Next Gondor also released a video on the parallels between Denethor and Theoden, and I've done a video on that topic before as well. And this is a really cool topic to me because their parallel is very clearly aimed at exploring kind of the differences between their leadership styles, the way they look at the world, their hope versus despair, all that kind of stuff. And it gives us a really nice contrast. Now the question is, can we do the same thing with Beren and Maedhros? And it's a little more complicated in their case. So we're going to take a look at that. But first, let's take a look at the actual parallels. And some of these are downright mind-blowing. Right off the top, of course, one of the key things is they're both bound by an oath, which they feel like they don't really have a choice but to keep. And in the two different cases, the reasons for this are slightly different. Maedhros, of course, is bound by the Oath of Feanor, which basically says, we will pursue anybody who keeps a Silmaril from us, no matter who they are, and we're never going to stop. And, you know, they basically call the eternal darkness on them if they don't keep their oath. They're therefore bound by their oath for the simple reason that if they don't, they're in really deep trouble. The quandary comes in, and Maglor points this out in the Silmarillion, is like, if we keep our oath, we're hosed too, because we're killing a bunch of people, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And at the end of it, of course, Eonwë and the triumphant forces of, you know, the Valar have possession of the Silmarils, and he's like, if we keep fighting this, and we fight against even the Valar for these, we're really just digging ourselves into an unrecoverable hole. Maedhros says, yeah, but we're still bound by the oath, and if we wait and hope they give it back, and then they don't, and we wage war in Valinor, it's even worse, so we're just hosed no matter what happens. Beren is in a slightly different position, because his oath is not necessarily one that he has to keep per se. It is an oath that he has to keep to get what he wants. Beren's oath is that he will bring Thingol a Silmaril in exchange for the Hand of Luthien. Now, he doesn't have to get the Hand of Luthien from Thingol, because she ends up following him, of course, and at the end of the day, she's like, we could just wander in the wild and be okay. And he's like, I feel like that's cheating. We're not going to go that route. So he eventually, you know, he tries to fulfill it and has his adventure, and he finally gets a Silmaril and all that fun stuff, right? All that happens. The fascinating thing here is he feels bound by it because even Luthien is with him, and he doesn't feel right having her but not doing what he's supposed to do, and he doesn't, you know, he can't send her back because she basically refuses to leave him, so he's kind of stuck. So they're both stuck in their own way, but for different reasons. Now, another interesting thing here is that the keeping of the oath itself is partly what brings about their own demise. So keeping the oath ends up, in Beren's case, leading to him, you know, getting the Silmaril, but then promptly losing it into the belly of Carcharoth, and in trying to stop Carcharoth in Doriath, he ends up getting killed. Maedhros eventually recovers his Silmaril by theft, and then it burns him so badly that he can't keep it, and he throws himself into a pit because he's just like, well, it's all over. So they both die basically as a result of keeping their oath, but in very different ways and for different reasons. There's also a kind of reverse parallel here, because Beren dies and then he comes back, whereas Maedhros throws himself into a pit and we don't hear anything else about him. And given what we know about Feanor, And what we can surmise about the fact that they're already in really deep trouble for the way that they've tried to keep their oath so far, the Sons of Feanor, including Maedhros, are probably not coming back anytime soon. So oddly enough, even though Beren is mortal and shouldn't be resurrected, reincarnated, or anything like that, he is. And even though Maedhros is an immortal who should be re-embodied in some way, he is probably not. So, both a parallel and a reverse parallel. But there's way more. Now, of course, one of the key things that set off this inquiry was the fact that they both lose a hand. And interestingly, they both lose their hand in attempting to get the Silmaril. In Maedhros' case, he has a arranged meetup with Morgoth's forces. Morgoth has said, you know, I'm gonna like send an embassy and we can negotiate and maybe I'll even give you a Silmaril. And Maedhros is like, I don't trust you. I'm gonna send a big force and I'm gonna ambush you and whatever. Morgoth cheats bigger than Maedhros and takes Maedhros captive. So Maedhros is attempting to get Silmaril, at least a Silmaril, out of this, fails, and then is held captive and hung by his hand, his right hand in this particular case. As a result of that, he's stuck and he can't get out. And then Fingon eventually comes to rescue him, and he tries to let him loose. He can't get to him at first, and so Maedhros just says, just shoot me and put me out of my misery. Fingon is about to shoot him. Thorondor shows up, brings him up there, and he tries to hack the chain off. Can't do it because Morgoth's chains are, you know, made by Morgoth and therefore way tougher than anything an elf could break. And he's like, just kill me, put me out of my misery. And instead, Fingon chops off his hand. So it's in the escape that he loses his hand. Similarly, for Beren, he loses his in the escape because he has the Silmaril, but he's trying to get away with Luthien. And then Karkaroth, who is woken back up, stops him and he's like, here, have a Silmaril. You can't handle this. And Karkaroth bites off his hand and swallows the Silmaril. And in fact, he can't handle it. But the point is, he loses his Silmaril as part of the escape, along with his hand. So there's that. But the other interesting point here, too, in the middle of all this, is both of them are involved in cutting iron as it happens, because Fingon is trying to cut the iron of the chain and can't do it. Beren has to cut through the iron of Morgoth's crown to get the Silmaril. So, kind of a distant parallel. The other really cool thing, though, which makes this a slightly more direct parallel, is the fact that both of them are rescued or with somebody who they really care about, who probably shouldn't be there in the first place. Because Fingon has every right at this point to assume that Maedhros has betrayed him, because when Feanor took the ships and left all the rest of the Noldor besides his own people, he burned the ships, even though Maedhros was like, hey, should we send him back for Fingon? Because Maedhros and Fingon were really great buddies back in Valinor. And so that didn't work out because Feanor was like, nope, forget them, we're just going to burn the ships. Everything I left behind is just dead weight anyway. So Maedhros is not actually against Fingon, and Fingon doesn't know that. And so he goes and rescues him, despite the fact that it looks like the Feanorians are all just scumbags. Similarly, Luthien probably shouldn't be there because Beren has tried to leave her behind 2 or 3 times by the point that they finally get to Angband itself. So neither Fingon nor Luthien should really, by rights, be anywhere near any of this activity, and yet they are, and are both crucial to everything that goes on. Luthien, of course, is what helps Beren get into Angband by putting Karkaroth to sleep. She doesn't really aid him in the escape so much, but it is, you know, she was a necessary part of that. Fingon is necessary to Maedhros' escape. Doesn't help him get into that situation, obviously, but on the back end, he's there and very important. So there's a lot of parallel just in that. On a broader look, another thing that's really interesting here is that of the 2 of them, Maedhros, and this is where we get a lot of reverse parallel type stuff, Maedhros has a right, in some sense, to the Silmarils. Feanor at this point has died, therefore the right to own the Silmarils has kind of passed to his children, Maedhros being the eldest of them, but he never manages to recover one, at least not until the very end, by which point he, you know, once he has it, it burns his hand so bad that he realizes that he's kind of forfeited it. Whether in legal terms or not is irrelevant. Like, practically speaking, he just can't possess it. Beren has no right to it, and in fact, by the terms of the hallowing that was done by Varda, which says that no, you know, nothing evil or even mortal flesh will be able to handle it without being burned. Beren has no right to touch a Silmaril at all, and yet his hand is not burned by the Silmaril, even though he's immortal. So, in a really weird twist, the one who should have the least claim to it not only gets it, but is able to keep it until he, loses it in trying to defend Luthien. Their motivations are also completely different because Maedhros is mainly doing it because A, his oath requires it, and B, because it's like the key thing that the whole, Feanorian quest is about, really, right? They're after Morgoth to get the Silmarils and to get revenge, but it's really all about the Silmarils at the end of the day. Beren's like, I don't care about the Silmaril, I want the girl. And it's really hard to imagine that any of the sons of Feanor, even Maedhros and Maglor, would use or give up the Silmaril in exchange for another person, given the fact that they're bound by their oath, and just in general, they're really hot to get the Silmaril back. Well, all three of them, but, one will be better than none. Maedhros also, in his attempts to get the Silmaril, is really more about waging war and large-scale conflict. Beren, both times he goes about it, he goes with Finrod in disguise, and then he goes with Luthien in disguise. He's doing it in a very sneaky kind of way, which brings up another interesting parallel. As I mentioned earlier, Maedhros gets captured, but he's being underhanded, and so is Beren. Beren is also being underhanded because he's pretending to be who he's not. So both of them, in their attempts to get the Silmaril, use underhanded means, although Beren in one sense is, at least doing it in a way that's not per se bad. Maedhros is, it's hard to fault him in a sense, but, he agreed to an embassy and then he broke the terms of the embassy, and, that's a little more morally questionable than what Beren is doing. Beren, he's basically acting as a spy in enemy territory, that's a thing you do. Maedhros agrees to terms and then breaks the agreements. So, a little more sketchy there. Another interesting thing is that, and this one is a little bit less of a direct parallel, but it's not a reverse parallel either. Beren, though he loses his hand, eventually does get the Silmaril back just before he dies, and is able to present it with his good hand to Thingol. Maedhros never gets his hand back, but he does regain his sword competence by learning to wield his sword equally well with his left hand as he previously did with his right. So they both regain something that they lost with their hand, even though it's not even remotely the same thing or necessarily what was really important in Maedhros' case. So that's another interesting connection. Both are also inheritors of something which is kind of key to their own quest. Maedhros inherits the Oath of Feanor and Feanor's whole thing. I mean, in one sense, he didn't inherit it because he took the Oath of Feanor before Feanor died. But when Feanor does die, he kind of re-emphasizes their oath to them and, says, look, y'all got to do this. Even though it's clearly hopeless, because Feanor recognizes this as he's dying, is like, yeah, this is not going to work, but do it anyway. So he, rebinds them to their oath, and Maedhros kind of inherits that because he's not only just a son of Feanor, he's also the eldest son of Feanor. So he's, kind of inheriting the most of it in some sense because he is the primary heir and by right the next High King of the Noldor, but he forfeits that to Fingolfin. Beren inherits the Ring of Barahir, without which he wouldn't have gone on his run with Finrod, which is probably key to him getting there eventually, because it's with Finrod that he eventually gets captured by Sauron, which leads to Luthien coming to rescue him, which leads to getting the Wolfheim of Draugluin and the Batfell of Thuringwithil, which is what they use to disguise themselves to eventually get into Morgoth's halls to eventually get the Silmaril itself. So they both inherit something which is really key to everything that follows. Another interesting point here is that Beren, in the process of trying to get the Silmaril, after he gets the first one, he's like, hey, there's two more here. I could just get all three. But then he fate or coincidence or whatever intervenes, and he doesn't manage to do that. and the knife that he's using snaps, wakes up Morgoth, and then everything goes bad. So he doesn't get quite everything that he was trying to get. Maedhros, when he eventually does get any Silmaril at all, it's only the two, one of which he shares with Maglor, because one of them has already sailed across the sea and is floating in the air as a star at this point. So neither of them get everything that they actually wanted to, and that's kind of unique in and of itself. Even though they do both recover a Silmaril, neither of them gets the whole package, as it were. And as a final point to cap off all of this, both of them die after obtaining the Silmaril. Beren twice, ironically. So Maedhros, of course, when he gets a Silmaril back finally, and one for him, one for Maglor, both he and Maglor lose their Silmaril promptly when they realize they just can't hold on to it because it's burning them. Maglor doesn't commit suicide the way Maedhros does. He just throws his into the sea and then sings about it weepily for who knows how long. Maedhros chucks himself into a fissure and dies a fiery death, and okay. Anyway, Beren, when he obtains the Silmaril the first time, he promptly loses his hand, but then when he finally gets it back, he then promptly dies shortly after giving it to Thingol. Oops. Then he comes back to life because of Luthien basically bringing Mondos to pity, which nobody else has ever done. And then he comes back to life. They go and live with the Green Elves in Tol Galen. And then Doriath falls, and the Silmaril with the Nauglamir is retaken by Beren when he ambushes the dwarves. And he gives this to Luthien, who is the greatest image of beauty in Middle-earth ever, besides the Valar. And after they obtain this, they don't live a whole lot longer before they die, and then the Silmaril is given to Dior. And the Silmarillion makes a comment to the effect that it seems like probably they waned faster than they would have because of the power of the Silmaril, and they died sooner than they might have otherwise, which is kind of interesting. It's also interesting, by the way, to note that while Maedhros seems completely hellbent on obtaining the Silmaril for the most part, Maedhros is really kind of the most patient of the brothers, and he will hold back a lot. But interestingly, it's when Luthien has the Silmaril, which is probably the most vulnerable it's been up to that point, because how are the Feanorians going to get to Doriath? If Melian doesn't want anybody in, they're not getting in, right? So they can't ever really go in there while Thingol has it, although they really like it. But while Luthien has it, and it's particularly vulnerable, seemingly, they don't dare go after it, which is really kind of fascinating. Why is that? It almost seems like kind of this is just the way the story has to go. But I find that interesting, and it's only after it goes to Dior with the renewed kingdom of Doriath, after Beren and Luthien finally die, that the brothers go after it again. And by this point, Maedhros is just like, do we have to do this? But he feels like he has to. And I feel like there's something interesting there, but I'm not quite sure I can put my finger on it. But at any rate, the point here being, as long as both of these two people are running around on the earth, their paths do not cross, which is really interesting. Now, Curufin and Celegorm, their paths crossed with Beren, but it's before he's got the Silmaril, and Maedhros never meets him, and apparently never meets Luthien either. So it's really fascinating that these two people who were both one-handed, as a result of trying to obtain a Silmaril, never crossed paths, even though, oddly enough, once Beren takes up residence in Tol Galen with the Green Elves, that's as close to the Feanorians as he ever gets. Like, that's kind of their territory, is in the eastern part of Beleriand. But Maedhros never does anything about it, because apparently Luthien with the Silmaril is just, like, untouchable for whatever reason. What do we do with all these parallels? There's a ton of them, and like I said, there's probably even more. But there's just so many. What's the point? Why are all these parallels here? Now, on the one hand, we do want to be cautious with this, as the Tolkien professor, Corey Olsen, has pointed out. It's like, just because there's a literary device going on doesn't mean you can necessarily draw significance from it. Sometimes it's just there to be cool, and that's it. But, as I mentioned earlier, the Denethor and Theoden parallel begs for the comparison, and it tells us not only a lot about the characters, but it also tells us something about the values that are being both promoted and denigrated in the contrast, right? Denethor's despair is a bad thing. Theoden's courage, though perhaps not ideal, is at least valuable and good. Can we use some similar kind of analysis to look at Beren and Maedhros and say, this is kind of what's being pointed at as the contrast, why one is better than the other? Some things are just kind of obvious, right? Like Maedhros going after the Silmaril is mainly done out of pride and selfishness, and it's his better nature that makes him hang back and say, we don't have to rush this, we can kind of wait and bide our time and do what we need to do and not mess with people that we don't need to be messing with right this second. Although that's technically probably in violation of his oath. He's at least got the sense to know that waging war with Thingol is probably not smart while we've got Morgoth up in the north, right? Beren's motivations are purely unrelated to the Silmaril itself. Like, he's doing it as a means of achieving a different goal, which is a perfectly laudable goal, right? He wants the girl, and there's nothing wrong with him having the girl, and the girl wants him, and Thingol just puts an arbitrary... I say arbitrary. It's actually the opposite of arbitrary. It's intentionally the hardest thing he could think of for Beren to accomplish. And that's another interesting point, too. It's like the whole idea that Beren, this mortal man, is going to achieve what the whole host of the Noldor couldn't possibly do. Right? The reverse parallel there. But his motivations are perfectly fine. Now, is it like the most noble motivation ever? Not necessarily, but it is kind of the most like fairy tale-ish, kind of motivation there is. It's like the guy going for the girl who is way better than him, and he's got to do something impossible. This is such a fairy tale type of trope that it's, if not necessarily the most noble reason to go after a Silmaril, it is at least... certainly way better than what Maedhros is doing. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, the way they go about their stuff. Like, Maedhros' methods are at least morally questionable, whereas Beren's seem perfectly legitimate, given they're in war with Morgoth. Like, going in disguise, not morally suspect, really. But breaking an agreement even with an enemy is... that's at least kind of arguable. And not only that, of course, but Maedhros does, when he finally feels compelled, does go out and actually wage war on other elves to try to obtain the Silmaril again. Like, he goes to some pretty bad lengths, even though he has bad feelings about it. He commits murder, effectively. I mean, that's what he's doing. So, clearly, those are some of the obvious things, right? That Maedhros does bad stuff, Beren does good stuff, and they're doing it for bad and good reasons. But I think there's more to it than that, too. The Beren and Maedhros comparison is interesting, if only because it does draw attention to the fact that the whole story of the Silmarillion is about these three jewels. And the one human to ever possess one, and one of the few people outside of Morgoth and Feanor himself, by the end of the story, the only people who have ever possessed Silmarils are Feanor, Morgoth, Beren, Luthien, Dior, and Thingol. That's pretty much it. Well, and for a short time, you have the dwarves who sacked Doriath, but that's a really short-lived thing. So Beren is one of a very small number of people who ever actually managed to own a Silmaril or possess it in any meaningful sense. And ironically, Maedhros, although he inherits the right to possess the Silmaril in some sense as the son of Feanor, he forfeits that right by everything he does, and he never gets to exercise it until it's way too late. And not only is it too late, it's after Beren has had it. And Beren is, the other funny thing about that is Maedhros actually takes the whole Beren and Luthien adventure as, he knows about it clearly, because we learn that in the preparation for what becomes the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, he takes their story as a sign of hope, which is kind of ironic because he also should be thinking, I need to get that Silmaril from them, which is an ugly path to go down, but nevertheless, the point being, given that he knows about their story and everything that happened, like the fact that, again, he never meets Beren, never crosses paths with him, even though he is the one who has, if anybody, of all people, the most right to have the Silmaril, and he never goes after it, at least while Beren is alive. There's just a really fascinating... It doesn't signify anything in particular. It's not symbolic of anything, but it's really fascinating that these two people who ought to be so closely connected in some way never apparently come anywhere near each other. It's kind of like Turin and Tuor. They're cousins, and you would think that they would be really closely connected, but they pass each other by happenstance, seemingly, one time, and don't recognize each other. It's not that it means anything, it's just one of those really cool story elements of, it's so close that there's a billion what ifs you could ask about it. And that's part of what makes the story kind of more interesting, is the fact that you have these moments of, this could have been just a little different, and who knows what could have changed. Because if Beren had actually gotten the Silmaril after the dwarves sacked Doriath, and then Maedhros and the other Feanorians had dared to attack, what could have happened? What would have happened if they just made a demand on Beren and Luthien for the Silmaril? Things that seemingly from the story should have happened, didn't. Which is just kind of bizarre. And that leaves so many possibilities for alternate storylines, is just kind of interesting to think about, even if it doesn't mean anything in and of itself. So, at the end of the day, I don't think we can really necessarily draw too much from these parallels beyond just really interesting story elements. It is, of course, designed in some way to kind of draw attention to the contrast. But I think more importantly, it's drawing attention to the fact that this one little thing, one of three little things, that is the center of the entire Silmarillion. It's named the Silmarillion for a reason. It's all about the Silmaril. Even though this thing that Beren possesses is key to the whole narrative, and Beren's story is in one sense kind of the center of the whole narrative, nevertheless, Maedhros and Beren, the two people who ought to have probably come into contact in some way for the sole reason that the Silmaril was so important, never did. And I think that tells us something about the Silmarillion itself, which is, you can't expect things to go as you might necessarily think. Like, it's part of the whole curse, in some sense, that Maedhros, even though he ought to be able to inherit the Silmaril, the whole curse that says you're not going to get what you want, and it's only going to get worse from here, it's partly because of that things didn't maybe go differently. If Feanor and his sons had been completely innocent in the whole thing, and hadn't been under the curse, might there have been a different type of outcome here? I mean, it makes you wonder if the whole backdrop of everything that went wrong with them leaving Valinor is why they never even came into contact. Like, it's just fate is keeping these things separate. Like, the Silmarils just aren't going to come to the Sons of Feanor until it's too late and there's nothing they can really do with it. So it's just really fascinating to look at it from that perspective, because the whole Silmaril thing being so central, and yet for this little period of time where it's just out there, apparently we're just not going to do anything with it. It's so strange when you really put your mind in that particular thing and think about it. Like, it doesn't make any sense. But it kind of does when you realize, well, that's kind of how it was always going to happen. Like, if Beren hadn't gotten the Silmaril, Maedhros was also not going to get it. Maedhros was just never going to get it. And the only reason they eventually do get it is because they're stealing it from the good guys, which is kind of like the capstone of everything they did wrong. So I just thought it was really cool how many parallels there were between Beren and Maedhros. I mean, these two one-handed people who were after a Silmaril, or in Maedhros 3, really. But I hope you found that interesting. If you can think of other parallels that I might have missed, leave those in the comments below. Like I said, I'm sure there were more, but I was like looking at it and just coming up with more and more and more, and I ran out of time before I had to make the video. But it's really cool to look at to find all of these. So leave those in the comments, like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Make sure you check all my social links below, especially Twitter, or the platform formerly known as Twitter, where I do Tolkien-related trivia questions, my Discord server, all that good stuff. If you're on YouTube and you want to catch all my future content, don't forget that bell icon after you subscribe. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Paul Leone and Nathan Dufour.